punctual interventions, but this obeys to a great design of imperial policy. What could you tell us about it?
Well, first I should say that the phrase imperial grand strategy is an interesting one. It's not mine. It's borrowed from a well-known, quite conservative international relations specialist writing in Foreign Affairs, which is the main establishment journal. This was the immediate reaction within weeks to the announcement, the declaration in September 2002 of the Bush administration's national security strategy, which aroused a great fear and concern around the world, but also within the foreign policy elite within the United States. He was pointing out that the imperial, what he calls the new imperial grand strategy, announced by the Bush administration, he discusses its dangers. He thinks, as many do, many conservative analysts, that it's an enormous danger to the world and to the interests of the United States as well. This kind of reaction was quite common across a large sector of elite opinion. In fact, Foreign Affairs had other articles in the coming months warning against the war in Iraq. Which everyone understood to be just an illustration, kind of an exemplary action to demonstrate that the imperial grand strategy is meant very seriously. We will attack anyone we feel like without any pretext or just because we have the power to do it. There's a second foreign policy journal called Foreign Policy, also had articles expressing severe criticism and reservations. This is quite unusual. I mean, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the major, most respectable, old, back to Revolutionary Times organization of intellectuals, did something which I think they've never done before. They published a monograph called War on Iraq, giving as sympathetic an account as they could of the Bush administration imperial grand strategy and the war, but then in a very cautious and muted way giving a rather harsh criticism of it. They never take positions on current international issues. Actually, the same is true elsewhere. When at the World Economic Forum, which in Davos, Switzerland, in last January, which is the gathering of the people who basically own the world. In fact, the business press calls them the masters of the universe, with only a little bit of irony. They were extremely hostile. Colin Powell was sent by the administration as an emissary to convince them to join in the war effort, and he was barely able to speak. The atmosphere was extremely hostile. And so this, as I say, it's not my phrase. It's a phrase that's used in conservative establishment circles out of concern for the implications of the strategy. Now, we have to be a little cautious about this, because they really don't object to the strategy. And in fact, it has roots going back 60 years, 70 years. In fact, at the early stages of the Second World War, before the United States had even entered the war, there were high-level planning groups of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations beginning to lay plans for the post-war world, which they assumed the United States would have a very influential position. I mean, up until the Second World War, the the United States had been by far the largest economy in the world. In fact, a century ago, it was the largest economy. But it was not a major actor on the world scene. It was in the region, so Central America and the Caribbean, and as far as Venezuela, Woodrow Wilson kicked the British out of Venezuela in 1920 because they wanted the oil. But that's a little bit in the Pacific. It wasn't like Britain or France. However, it was understood that after the Second World War that would change, and the United States would be a world dominant power, the world dominant power. So they laid plans, and among them were plans which, when you read them, I quote some of them in the book, are not very different from the Bush administration Imperial Grand Strategy. I mean, they spoke about the need for the United States to be a world dominant power, to prevent exercise of sovereignty by other powers who might interfere with U.S. designs, and recognize that to do this would require a major military force permanently. But the point is, it's not brazenly declared as an announcement to the world that we are going to control you by force. It's quiet diplomacy or internal planning. It's not meant for people to see outside of small circles. And I mean, unless you read, declassified records, or you don't read it in the newspapers or the journals and so on. The Bush administration is not out of the spectrum of planning, but it's at a very extreme end. In fact, there's interesting follow-up articles, again, in Foreign Affairs, which gives the Journal of Foreign Affairs, which gives a good picture of mainstream establishment thinking. But in the post-war issues, there are articles by people like Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State under Clinton, who says, look, the basic ideas, she says, are correct, but you don't declare them like that. You keep them quiet, and you only use them when you have to. You don't want to antagonize the whole world and turn the world into people who are frightened and defensive. And others pointed out quite correctly, and the administration knows this, which is interesting. It was very widely predicted by intelligence agencies, foreign policy analysts, that the Imperial Grand Strategy and the war, which was intended to exemplify it, would increase proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, would increase the risk of terror, and would in fact cause enormous dangers.
If this is true, which I fully agree with you, what is the novelty brought about by the Bush administration? Perhaps that they say what others think and didn't say, or that they are doing things which others didn't.
It's both.
Both.
Once you declare it publicly, instead of keeping it sort of in your pocket in case you need it, when you declare publicly, we are going to dominate the world by force if necessary, we are going to prevent any potential challenge to our domination. We will act without any concern for international law or the United Nations. In fact, if you read the national security strategy, there's barely a mention of international law in the United Nations, and the actions of the administration illustrate that they have utter contempt for international institutions. They want to destroy them. International law doesn't matter. The U.S. will simply be what we should call a rogue state, a powerful rogue state which will do what it wants. And if you don't like it, too bad for you. So it's first of all the brazen announcement of this, but then the implementation of it. I mean, there were a number of reasons for invading Iraq, but one reason, it was widely recognized, I think correctly, that one reason was just to illustrate that when we say we are going to attack anyone we want without a pretext, we'll do it. and we don't care what you think. So it was, you recall that right after the strategy was announced, the Bush administration, including Colin Powell, the so-called moderate, informed the Security Council very clearly that you can, as they put it, be relevant and endorse what we're going to do anyway. So you can put your meaningless stamp of approval on it if you want, or else you can be a debating society. You can talk to each other, but we're going to go ahead anyhow. And in fact, very dramatically, on the there was 2 days before the a few days before the invasion, there was a summit meeting of Bush and Blair and Aznar, who I suppose was there to wash the dishes or something, and they met in the Azores, an American military base. And the reason they had to meet there is they had to keep themselves very far away from any human beings. It's like the World Trade Organization meeting in Doha, you know. So they met in the Azores, and they issued a very interesting statement. Not enough people paid attention to it. This is right on the eve of the war. They issued an ultimatum, but not to Saddam Hussein. The ultimatum was to the Security Council. And it said, you can give your stamp of approval or else goodbye. And they also said very clearly that they would invade even if Saddam Hussein and his family left the country. In other words, the purpose wasn't to get rid of them, it was to take over Iraq. And if you, the rest of the world, don't like it, that's your problem. Now, there's another aspect to this which should be recognized. The United States has been the major military power in the world since the Second World War. Now it is beyond any historical parallel. I mean, U.S. military spending is approximately on a par with the rest of the world combined.
Almost half of the total.
It's almost half the total, and depending on how you count. And furthermore, it's technologically far more advanced. So they're in planning and in development. There are schemes which sound futuristic but can be implemented, which do really threaten human survival. That's the reason for the title of the book. So one of the major issues for the last several years has been the militarization of space, which is a very serious matter. There is a space treaty, Outer Space Treaty, 1967, which tries to reserve space for peaceful uses, and everyone signed it. It's been brought up at the General Assembly for the last few years because everyone knows that the U.S. is intending to violate it. Actually, this goes back to Clinton, but more extreme now. The U.S. has voted against it. I think abstained, which amounts to a vote against. And no one else will go along. Israel goes along, but that's reflexive. It's like Ukraine going along with Russia back in the old days. Occasionally, Pacific, Micronesia will go along, but essentially the whole world versus the United States in an effort to try to reaffirm and strengthen the Outer Space Treaty. There have been negotiations at there's a UN Disarmament Commission, which have been stalled since the Clinton years, in fact. But last October, the Bush administration simply blocked any further efforts there to ban militarization of space. They've also blocked other treaties. They've dismantled the ABM treaty, trying to put enforcement mechanisms into banning bacteriological warfare. They want to dismantle any framework of international control and move on to develop means of destruction which are very frightening. And that's another side of it. Actually, this is part of the reason for the fiscal crisis that they're creating in the United States. Again, stress, these are not conservatives. This is the biggest increase in federal spending since the Reagan years, biggest one since then, and it's for offensive weapons.
situation is that after the war was won, after all the many soldiers killed during the apparently the peacetime in Iraq, the thing is that the Bush administration is coming back to the UN in a very humble position, because almost begging for the UN to come in. How do you see this?
Well, one of the, again, from conservative sectors, they were being warned that their arrogance and brazen contempt for the world were going to get them into a lot of trouble. I mean, violence is a very good means of intimidation, but it doesn't intimidate everyone. You know, there are other powerful forces around, there's people around, and they react in their own ways. Amazingly, in fact, I'm extremely surprised, they have failed to carry out a successful military occupation in Iraq, which is remarkable. If you look at historical analogs, military occupations have been quite successful under far more difficult conditions. I mean, even the worst monsters, I mean, take, say, the Nazis. They conquered Europe. This is the most vicious regime in the world, but they had no trouble running it. I mean, Europe was run by collaborators. The political collaborators, the military, the police and the security forces were collaborators. I mean, the Nazis are in the background. If anything went wrong, they'd step in, but for the most part it was successful, and they were under attack. You know, after all, they were under attack mainly by the Russians, fighting a huge war with the Russians, but also being attacked by Britain and the United States. And the resistance in Europe was very courageous, but they would have crushed the resistance if it hadn't had outside support. And it had enormous outside support. Well, there's nothing like that in Iraq. I mean, they're moving into a country which was absolutely devastated by sanctions. Before the war. And it's interesting that in the United States, you virtually cannot talk about this. So if you read the press and the journals and so on, they say the country was in bad shape, but because of Saddam Hussein. Now, you know, anyone who's looked at the record, and there's a rich record, knows the country was in horrible shape because of the extremely cruel and brutal U.S. sanctions. I mean, they technically through the UN, but everyone knows the UN would never have implemented them, at least in this form, if it wasn't for U.S. pressure. So it had devastated the civilian society. It had actually strengthened the tyrant, made the population very dependent on him for survival. It's one of the reasons he wasn't overthrown, I think. So the country was devastated. It was almost totally disarmed. It was under heavy surveillance by the U.S. It was being regularly bombed for years by the U.S. and Britain. I mean, you know, the country was a complete wreck. Here the United States moves in. It ends the sanctions. It gets rid of a murderous tyrant who the U.S. had in fact supported but didn't want him now. So it gets rid of a tyrant, ends the sanctions, no outside support for the resistance to speak of. How come they can't? I mean, it's just a perfect situation for a military occupation to come in, find collaborators, run the country, reconstruct it. Everybody should be pleased. But they failed, which is astonishing.
Is there any hypothesis about this monumental failure? Because
it's a monumental failure.
Because what you say, it is quite interesting, because the Nazis occupied all Europe and
no problem.
They ran the country.
No problem.
And
or take, say, the Russians in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
I mean, they weren't popular, yes. But who ran Poland? Who ran Czechoslovakia? I mean, the people in the country who, if they got out of control, the Russians might move in. But, or say the United States and Central America. You know, it's just sort of the same story. You get collaborators to do it for you. If they don't do it properly, maybe you move in. But the United States and Iraq has failed. Well, why? Well,
have you any hypothesis on that? Or?
I do, actually. A few. I can't A couple of weeks ago. Well, a few weeks ago, I happened to be speaking to someone I can't identify. He's a high official of a leading NGO, and who has been in Baghdad since the war, trying to reorganize health services, educational services. He has a lot of experience all over the world, and his organization has more experience than anyone. He told me he's never seen anything like it. His phrase was arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence. Three: arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence. And that's the kind of critique they've been getting from inside. I mean, the U.S. military was bitterly critical of the civilians in the Pentagon, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and the rest. The military said, you just don't understand what you're doing. These people are extremely arrogant. They know they have enormous power, in principle. They don't have, they feel they can run roughshod over everything. They don't care. So they'll just move in. Everybody will do what they're told, and that's the end of it. The soldiers who are there are basically untrained. They don't know what they're there for. They don't know how to deal with the population. They have neither experience nor training with dealing with an occupied population. They're not purposely, but just by the way they behave, they're antagonizing people. When people are antagonized, they react. That leads to more conflict. The civilian administrators didn't give a thought to how to run the country. In fact, just to illustrate, in early May, so this is after the war, when Paul Bremer, the new civilian administrator, came in, the New York Times published an organization chart. It's very illuminating. I mention it there. The organization chart of how to run Iraq. And it's like a corporate organization chart, boxes and lines and this sort of thing. Who controls who and who answers to who. I think it had 16 boxes. At the top is Paul Bremer answering to the Pentagon. And then there are various lines going down, and each box has in it a name in boldface and a description of the person, of the function. And it's generals and diplomats and all either American or British or mostly American generals and so on. And then at the very bottom of the chart, there's a little box which has no name and no function and no boldface, half the size of the others. It says Iraqi government advisors. Now, that's the picture of how you run the world. Well, maybe you can run an ant colony that way, but not human society. And their sense of arrogance and power and ignorance is so enormous that they make horrible mistakes. Incidentally, this is not new either. I mean, take, say, Henry Kissinger. I mean, his ignorance of world affairs was startling, and it led to horrible mistakes from his own point of view. But these people are, and there was plenty of arrogance there too, but nevertheless, this is extreme. It's not, I don't want to suggest it's unique, and in fact, it's important that it isn't unique. These are institutional facts that are deeply rooted and show up in many different ways. Latin Americans don't have to be told that. They're familiar with it. But in this case, it happens to be an extremely extreme example.
public opinion going along with this?
American public opinion doesn't know a thing about it.
They don't even think about it.
I mean, everything I've just said has been unreported.
Unreported by the press.
Well, you know, you can find an occasional mention here and there. So, I mean, if you read the elite press, you know, Washington Post, and you really read it carefully, you'll find some reference to it. But for example, the Bush administration stand last October at the UN blocking an effort to ban militarization of space, and they also blocked an effort to reaffirm a 1925 protocol banning bacteriological warfare. That was banned. That wasn't reported anywhere. And most of what I've just described, almost no one knows about unless you know, have a special interest in the topic. It's not secret material. It's all public, you know. But it does not, I'm sure if there was a poll in the public, you wouldn't find one person in 100,000 has ever heard of it, you know. So how does the public react? Well, they can't, you know, they don't know. You know.
You mentioned something very interesting in our conversation yesterday regarding the misperception and misinformation, which is intentionally created by the press. Can you give a very rapid...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I was referring to a study that just was just released by the major public opinion analysis organization, actually in the world. It's a very serious one, the academic polling institution program on international policy attitudes. They released a document called Misperceptions of Iraq. And the misperceptions were uncontroversial matters, you know, cases where the CIA would say it's a misperception, you know, so they weren't trying to be controversial. And they polled people to see, did they have these misperceptions? So do you think that the world supported the invasion? Or do you think that Saddam Hussein is working with Al-Qaeda, you know, things like that? And the misperception level was extremely high.
Extremely high, right?
Extremely high. I mean, nobody's done it in other countries, but I'm sure that you would find almost nothing like it, almost no beliefs like that in other countries. And then they went further and correlated misperceptions with news sources. Well, you know, it turns out that I think over 20% of the population gets their information from radio and commercial television. Well, if you listen to the radio in the United States, I mean, it's, you know, it's literally raving maniacs half the time. The radio has been bought up by right-wing foundations who offer advertising to small, you know, companies if they are willing to run talk shows, so-called, led by people who are just off the spectrum. I mean, they're so extreme that you hardly publish an article in a newspaper. That's 20% of the, and the public, commercial television is essentially nothing. So that's the main one. Then they, if you look at the rest, there's one ultra-right television channel, Fox News, and people were watching Fox News, which probably is most of the population. About 80% of them had at least one serious misperception, usually more. If you look at people who are getting their information from the print media, newspapers, journals, there's about 50% serious misperceptions. If you go to the lowest was National Public Radio and Television, the public ones, semi-public ones, which are more oriented towards an elite, educated audience. And even there, it was about 25% serious misperceptions of a kind which I'm sure you would not find almost anywhere in Europe or Latin America. And the misperceptions were highly correlated with support for the war, which is quite reasonable. Now, when did all of this come? Well, you know, it came, you can trace it. It began pretty much in September 2002, the same time that they announced the national security strategy. They essentially announced the planned invasion of Iraq, and they also started a huge propaganda campaign, which was conveyed by the media, you know, pretty uncritically. I mean, sometimes there'd be a hesitance, and you just check the polls, and you see as this campaign began, the fears exploded. I mean, within a few weeks, a majority of the population in the United States considered Iraq a threat to the security of the United States. Now, you know, I mean, even in Kuwait, they didn't regard Iraq as a threat to the security of Kuwait. I mean, they knew they hated them, but they knew it's the weakest country in the region that barely holds together. I mean, I'm sure there was no other country in the world where anyone thought Iraq was a threat. You know, horrible, maybe, a terrible monster, but not a threat. But in the United States, it was a majority. And then something quite interesting happened, which shows you how a well-disciplined propaganda system works. A few weeks later, Congress passed a resolution authorizing the president to use force against Iraq because of the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Iraq. Well, two comments. First of all, that's outlandish. But second comment is that no one pointed out that they were simply copying a declaration of national emergency by Ronald Reagan in 1985 when he declared a national emergency in the United States because of the unusual and extraordinary threat, those are the words, unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States posed by Nicaragua. Yeah, 2 days driving time from Texas, you know. And then he went on to make speeches about how he knows the terrible difficulty he's facing, but he remembers a man named Winston Churchill who stood up against the Nazis, and he's going to be courageous, and no matter how terrible the odds, he's going to defend us from the threat of the Sandinistas, you know, marching into Texas tomorrow. Did people laugh? No. And if you begin to pay attention to this, you understand what's happening in the country. I mean, people who are now running the government are pretty much the same ones who ran it from 1981 to 1992. And they're using this, they're following the same script. Did they recall this last October? Not one word. No. There was no mention of it in the press or in the intellectual journals of opinion. I mean, this is out of people's minds. No one knows it. No one knows that the United States was condemned by the World Court and by the Security Council, except that the U.S., of course, vetoed the resolution, for its terrorist war, ordered to stop, pays huge reparations.
They didn't even answer
They didn't even answer. I mean, and it's gone. It's out of history. And it's worse, you know, it gets worse. And it shows you how they can have some hope of running the country under these conditions when they're really harming and threatening the population. On May 1st, you remember this May 1st, there was a very carefully staged extravaganza where they had the president land in combat gear on an aircraft carrier. Yeah, it was carefully placed so you get the right television images. I mean, it's just shamed the country, you know, except that it was treated like a great occasion inside. I mean, outside it was regarded either with fear or ridicule, you know. But Bush landed there and gave his victory speech.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
The front page story in the New York Times either pretended to take it seriously or actually took it seriously. It's hard to know. But they said that, the phrase they used was, he said, Bush gave a victory speech. It was a splendid Reagan-esque finale to the war. What are they referring to? Well, what they're referring to is the Reagan administration invasion of Grenada. You know, Reagan succeeded in conquering the nutmeg capital of the world, overcoming the 6,000 U.S. Special Forces, overcame the resistance of a few dozen paramilitary construction workers, And then came a speech saying, we're standing tall. That was his phrase. We have succeeded in defending ourselves from the tremendous threat to our existence posed by Grenada. Grenada. I mean, the story was that there was an air base being built, which there was, a tourist air base, air facility. And this is the Russians could use this as a military base, assuming they could find it on a map, and they could bomb the United States from Grenada, but the heroic cowboy came in, saved us. We're standing tall.
Its military potential is unrelated to any conceivable threat to this island country of under 110,000 people. The Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force. Who is it intended for? It isn't nutmeg that's at stake in the Caribbean and Central America. It is the United States' national security.
That's what they're referring to when they speak of the powerful Reagan-esque finale of the Iraq War. And do you think there was a comment on this? No, because it's just part of the intellectual culture. Yeah, we're under attack constantly, from within as well. I mean, as I'm sure you know, there's a huge prison population in the United States. I mean, way beyond relative to population anyone, maybe 5 to 10 times as high as Europe. It has nothing to do with crime. Crime is about the same in the United States as other industrial societies. But since it's actually a neoliberal phenomenon, it begins in the late 70s, picks up under Reagan, and by now it's just outlandish. And although crime is not greater than elsewhere, fear of crime is far greater. Same with drugs. You know, drugs elsewhere are some kind of problem. In the United States, fear of drugs is enormous. And those things combine to carry out something which has a certain analogy to social cleansing in Latin America. You know, you send out the security forces to get rid of the undesirables by murdering them or something. In the United States, it's more civilized. You don't murder them, you put them in jail. And the undesirables are overwhelmingly black males, secondarily Latinos, a much smaller number of others. And they're basically, it's an internal counterinsurgency program against the the poor, who happen poor in the United States is highly correlated with race. So it's basically a counterinsurgency campaign against the black and Latino population.
Tell me one thing. We are in a country in Cuba today in which the hostility of the United States government has been lasting for over 4 decades. What are we supposed to expect from this Imperial Gran strategy, not only in Cuba but in Latin America? What is Latin America roles in that Imperial Gran strategy?
Well, again, you know, the Bush administration is at an extreme end of a spectrum which is not very broad. In fact, in the case of Cuba, it's extremely narrow. I mean, remember, it was the Kennedy administration, the opposite extreme of the spectrum, that carried out the large-scale terrorist atrocities in Cuba. Operation Mongoose under Kennedy was a major terrorist war. After the Bay of Pigs, first they tried an invasion. When that failed, came a terrorist campaign right out of the White House, run by Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, and it was very serious. I mean, it was, you know, sinking fishing boats, poisoning crops, attacking hotels, killing people, blowing up petrochemical installations. I mean, it was not a joke. I mean, then it went on later, you know, shooting down airliners, all sorts of things. But most of it was in the Kennedy administration. It almost led to a nuclear war. It was a major factor behind the missile crisis, which came very close to a terminal nuclear war, very close. Right, just to illustrate how the spectrum, right after the missile crisis, it had finally settled down, didn't destroy the world, barely. Kennedy immediately escalated the terrorist campaign again, included assassination attempts, but that was only a part of it. Right after that, a leading elder statesman, Dean Acheson, Democratic senior statesman who was an advisor to the Kennedy administration, gave a speech to the American Society for International Law. This is January 1963, in which he instructed the international law profession that, as he put it, no legal issue arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its position, prestige, or authority. So no threat, just a challenge to our position and power. He was referring to Cuba. In that case, no matter what we do, no legal issue arises. Now, that's the opposite end of the spectrum. And it continues to the present. And of course, the U.S. protects terrorists. I mean, the FBI regards Orlando Bosch as a leading terrorist. I think they accuse him of, 30 terrorist acts. President Bush #1 gave him a presidential pardon over the strong objections of the U.S. Justice Department, who said this is a threat to the security of the United States. But it doesn't matter. We protect terrorists as long as they attack Cuba. Now, what happens to Cuba now? Well, part of the consequence of the surprising failure in Iraq, which did lead them, as you say, to go to the UN sort of hat in hand and say, help us out, part of it is the need to create some other crisis. I mean, they have failed in their so-called war on terror, which is mostly fraud. They have dramatically failed to achieve objectives that you can boast about. Having caught Osama bin Laden, terror is increasing. The effect of the Iraq war was to increase terror exactly as was predicted. They have to do something. So what they have to do is have a victory somewhere. And it has to be a cheap victory. You don't want to get involved with anybody who can resist. So immediately, almost immediately, same time they went to the UN, Cuba was raised to the second rank of terrorist states, right below North Korea and Iran, on the grounds that it's producing chemical and biological weapons. Do you need evidence? No. What's evidence? No. You just repeat it often enough, it becomes a truth, it gets repeated by the media. That's one consequence, but I think there's something much more interesting and far-reaching happening, and that's illustrated pretty dramatically in Brazil. Brazil has been called for a century the Colossus of the South. It's a country that has the capacity to be rich and powerful, a lot of resources. It could be a counterpart to the Colossus of the North. Of course, it's never achieved that result for various reasons. 40 years ago, under the Kennedy administration, Brazil had a mildly populist president with some degree of popular support, Lula. Nothing like Lula, but moderately populist. Well, the Kennedy administration organized a military coup to overthrow him. It was the first and most important, after Argentina, of the major military coups that swept the continent, Chile, getting to Central America, and so on. That was the first and most important, because they would not tolerate a moderately populist leader with a degree of political support. Now, Lula just was voted in with massive popular support. That's a real triumph of democracy, for popular organizations to overcome a tremendous concentration of power and elect their own candidate. I mean, inconceivable in the United States and hard to imagine in Europe. But here's an amazing triumph of democracy. There's no call for a military coup. Well, why? It's much more threatening to U.S. interests than Goulart. The reason is, first of all, the populations wouldn't accept it anymore. It changed since the 1960s.
acribillándome a balazos, podrán impedirme voluntad que hacer cumplir el programa de...
But more important than that is they don't need it. The neoliberal mechanisms that have been instituted, for example, by Clinton, we're now the other extreme of the spectrum. The neoliberal mechanisms are designed so as to prevent democracy. So you can vote anybody in you want. You can vote Communist Party, and nothing they can do because thanks to the neoliberal mechanisms, the governments are in a stranglehold of financial markets. That's the result of currency liberalization 30 years ago. Not a big insight. Keynes pointed out 70 years ago that if you have free flow of capital and free speculation against currencies, governments can't do anything because the economy can be destroyed by capital flight, by attacks on currencies, and so on. So if you want to preserve some space in which governments can function, you have to have limitations on capital. And the post-war economic system that Keynes and white United States designed did have those constraints. That enabled Western European countries and the United States to carry out welfare state policy, mildly social democratic policies. Well, that was all dismantled in the early 70s. The other mechanisms of the neoliberal program are also carefully designed to eliminate democracy. And it takes a privatization. And there's no economic motivation for it. Nobody's presented any. But privatization does reduce the public arena. Meaning it reduces the arena of public participation. If you go to Geneva today and you look at the negotiations on GATS, trade and services, which are technically not serious, but not secret, but nobody knows about them. Those are designed to take just about anything that human beings could be concerned about, water, education, health, electricity, anything that people might care about, and take it out of the public arena, put it into the hands of private tyrannies. That's what corporations are. They are totalitarian institutions internally, unaccountable to the public. They are designed by law to be completely pathological. I mean, they have been given by the power, they're creations of the state, but they were Anglo-American creations mainly. They're created to have the rights of persons, by now rights far beyond persons, but to be pathological persons. By law, the head of a corporation, by law, must be a monster. His only concern must be to maximize the wealth of shareholders who have given him his money. A corporation is allowed to act benevolently, but only if it's hypocritical, only if it's for public relations purposes. I mean, if this was true of a person of flesh and blood, we'd send them for psychiatric treatment, But this is institutionally required, So first of all, they're pathological persons by law and institution with the power of the state behind them, and they're almost unaccountable to the public except by weak regulatory mechanisms which are being dismantled. If they can take over, and of course they're all integrated and tied to the few big states and so on, it's nothing remotely like a free market. If you can take almost the entire public arena and hand it over to them, democracy isn't a problem any longer. People can vote, and it's becomes like the UN, a debating society. That's a major difference, and that's been going on for 20 or 30 years. Again, these people are extreme, but not off the spectrum. So you don't have to have military coups.
So my last question would be, the United States is facing a new presidential election next year. In February we will have the New Hampshire primary once again. In this general context, is there any danger that this aggressive imperialistic strategy may take one of our countries as a target for new hostilities, aggression, invasion, or what? How do you see that panorama?
I think it's not likely that there will be actual invasion. For one thing, because it's understood in Washington I mean, they're not stupid. They understand that you do not attack anyone who will defend themselves. That's ridiculous. You only attack people if it's Grenada, you know, or Iraq when it's totally devastated. But any place that might offer some resistance is much too dangerous. So actual aggression, if a society is, if you can get a society to implode, you know, to be so, maybe if you can force a society to be repressive and economically collapsing and so on, so that the population will just, you know, come out of control, you know, then you can invade, but not under other conditions. However, what they will probably try to do, I think, and they've said so, I mean, is create a threat, construct a security threat. In fact, that's just what happened last September. September 2002, when these events were taking place, was also the opening of the midterm congressional elections. And that's time for that. The Karl Rove, who's the campaign manager for the Republicans and probably the most important man in Washington, he had already instructed the party activists in the preceding summer that when they go into the elections, the last November elections, they would have to suppress social and economic issues where the policies are highly unpopular because they're really harming people, and they would have to stress security issues. So make it look as if there's a threat, and if there's a threat, you sort of put aside your day-to-day concerns and you huddle under the umbrella of power. And that's pretty much what happened. Remember, they barely hold political power. A few tens of thousands of votes is all they won by. In the year 2000, they lost, actually. But people did shift priorities. So enough people decided to put aside their concerns and tremble in fear in front of the demonic threat of Iraq so that they were able to just squeak through the election. And Rove has already said they're going to have to do the same thing for the next election. In fact, that ridiculous May 1st performance on the aircraft carrier, the more serious press, like the Wall Street Journal, business press, pointed out right away that this was not a victory speech about Iraq. It was the opening gun in the presidential campaign, because they understand that, which is true, that these people in power now, in order to hold power, must frighten the country and present themselves as somehow defending themselves. So the Republican convention next fall is in New York, is timed right at the time of September 11th. I think it's the next day. They say that's accidental, but how much genius does it take to figure out why they would have a convention September 12th in New York City? Okay, we don't have to talk about it. They delayed the convention for that. They have already, every speech of the president is carefully written for him to read, so that it says, we have won a victory over a tyrant who was developing weapons of mass destruction and was working with Al-Qaeda to plan further terrorist attacks on the United States. I mean, there's not a particle of truth to that. I mean, his own intelligence agencies tell him that's outlandish, but it doesn't matter. You just keep repeating it, and it becomes true, like Grenada is a threat, or Nicaragua is a threat. And they're going to have to do that. They'll have to, and in order to do that, they may need to concoct an artificial threat, which is not that difficult. I mean, if you can get people to be afraid of Grenada, you know, how much trouble does it take to concoct a threat? And this is second nature for the people in office. That's how they ran the country for 12 years. I mean, the internal programs of the Reagan-Bush 1 administration harmed most of the population. You look at, say, real wages. They stagnated or declined for a majority of the population. Working hours increased to the point where in the richest country in the world, people work probably, I think, a month more a year than they did at the beginning of the Reagan years, or in any comparable country. They passed Japan years ago. and there are very few benefit systems are very weak. You know, there's 45 million people who don't even have any health care guaranteed. There's 30 million people hungry every night. And this is a country of enormous wealth, you know, and people know it. I mean, in 1992, after their 12 years, Reagan was ranked as the most unpopular living president in the country. It was right next to Nixon, way below Carter or Ford. But they held on to power, and they held on to power by constant fear, you know. And they've already said they're going to have to do the same thing for the next election. And there aren't a lot of ways to inspire fear. I mean, you know, you can invent a grenade, but something has to be there. Like at least they have to be building an an airfield, you know, or Nicaragua, you know. Yeah,
Could they try to invent a threat coming from Cuba?
Yeah, they're already trying it. I mean, they've already announced that Cuba is the next tier of terrorist states right after North Korea and Iran, along with Syria, because it's developing biological and chemical weapons. And what they're hoping for, and Cuba can give them a gift if it wants to, is that Cuba will become very repressive in response, and that'll cause popular discontent, and that they won't be able to handle the economy. Same as in Nicaragua, giving talks in Nicaragua in the mid-1980s, and I constantly said the same thing because it's obvious. If you want to give a gift to the United States, become as repressive as possible, you know, suppress dissidents, you know, be corrupt, you know, steal from the public. I mean, they pay you for that in Washington.
It's what they expect.
It's what they love, you know, because then you can build. And if it doesn't happen, they'll pretend it anyway. But if it does happen, then it's a gift. I mean, then you can build up popular support in the United States to protect ourselves from, you know, these people are threatening us with chemical and biological weapons, and furthermore, the worst tyrant since Genghis Khan, and so on and so forth. So the more you give those I mean, it's wrong in itself, but the more you give those opportunities, the better, the more they applaud in the ultra-right-wing circles in Washington, you know, the Heritage Foundation and so on. So they probably, and Venezuela is another case.
Venezuela.
Yeah, and Venezuela is very important. I mean, as I said, the United States had limited international outreach prior to the Second World War, but Woodrow Wilson, which taught in school, you know, take a political science course, you learn about Wilsonian idealism. He was actually one of the most brutal U.S. presidents. And one of his exercises of Wilsonian idealism was to kick the British out of Venezuela. Britain was the big enemy then. And take over Venezuela, support a murderous dictator because of Venezuela's enormous oil resources. Yeah, it's been held ever since. Now Venezuela is out of control. In fact, the whole Andean region is out of control. From Bolivia up to Venezuela, to Colombia, and Ecuador, and Peru, and partially Brazil. And that's a serious concern. That's a major source it's one of the major sources of U.S. oil, has other resources, investment opportunities, and they might very well concoct something in the Andean region.
The real truth, therefore, is that what they are really upset about and concerned about is the fact of the greater revolution. They are opposed to any small independent countries that are determined to strike out on their own path of development. Other people in the region see free healthcare. They see free education. They see unemployment disappearing. Unemployment from 49% has come down to under 12%. They understand that the people are excited about the new popular democratic structures that we are building. These things are matters of tremendous concern to this American administration, and it is really that example that they are afraid of.